Tired flight attendant is ordered to get an in-flight movie that is interesting enough and maliciously complies. Updated, new information and clarifications. This malicious compliance belongs to my beautiful wife, but since it is from many decades ago, from a time before we knew each other, we will call her classy flight attendant here. First, the usual disclaimers. I am on a computer, so completely responsible for the formatting. English is both my first and third language, and my mother was a school teacher, so I am also completely responsible for my use of grammar and spelling, although I do not care to hear about it if the spelling tends to vacillate between British and American standards. Or the punctuation for that matter. Dialogue is translated from the original language and is given as reported to me. The setup: at the time of this event, classy flight attendant is one of the top-tier flight attendants for her country's national airline. Strictly speaking, any of their flights that do not involve ports in the USA or its territories, are not required to follow all FAA rules. However, whenever they fly to ports regulated by the FAA, they are expected to follow those rules to the T. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way in practice. On this occasion, classy flight attendant has just landed from Europe at her home airport in South America, only to learn that she is being turned around for a round trip to New York City. She protests. By the time she lands in New York, she will be well outside FAA rest period rules with all the consequences that could follow. Her supervisors don't care. They need her on that flight right now. And away she goes. But she knows the flight to New York isn't the real problem, it's the return trip that will be pure misery. Her compatriots flying home from New York tend to be extremely entitled. They are coming from New York. That makes them somebody now. They will refuse drink service when offered, and then when the flight attendant is 3 or 4 rows further along, push the call button and order a drink. They will keep an attendant hoping back and forth the whole flight for stupid little things, many of them things they could actually do for themselves. Classy flight attendant is tired, and knows that dealing with this entitled crowd on the return trip is going to be the worst. As they get into New York, she is told to go check out an in-flight movie for the return trip. The suggestion is made to make it interesting enough to keep the passengers too busy to order the flight crew around that much. Cue the malicious compliance. The malicious compliance, as she looks over the options and finds the perfect film, it will keep the passengers riveted to their seats. Frankly, given the nature of the film, she isn't even sure why it exists in the cartridge format used on planes at this time. Perhaps because the format is also used on some yachts and cruise ships? She orders it. Once on board, she keeps it secret. She knows that once she pops it in and it starts to play, the systems in use at that time cannot be stopped. But any time before that, she could be thwarted. Mid-flight, as the plane is well out over the ocean on its way south, she pops it in. Airport 77. For those who don't know, this film is about an airplane crashing in the ocean and passengers and crew trying to escape with their lives from 100 feet underwater. The results are immediate and absolute. While there are many white knuckles, no one seems inclined to press their call buttons, and classy flight attendant has a very quiet, uninterrupted rest for the remainder of the flight home. The aftermath: as she is deboarding, one old lady is heard to say that she will never fly national airline again. When called on the carpet for her movie choice, classy flight attendant feigns ignorance, claiming to have thought it was the much more comical Airplane, and that the name was lost in translation. She is given a 3-day suspension, which is for her a much-needed rest. Oh, and she will never be allowed to pick the in-flight movie ever again. Updates and clarifications. Acknowledgements. First, let me give a very warm thank you to this community for your interest in me, the least interesting part of this story really, and my beautiful wife, for your support and also for your heartfelt, honestly expressed concerns about possible collateral damage from her actions. Even for those who have outright doubted the possibility that this could ever happen, even though it is strictly speaking contrary to the subreddit's rules to pursue such inquiries, I personally don't mind them and find them useful. To all who gave awards, if I failed to thank you, any of you personally, At some points things were moving so fast I fear I may have. Please accept here and publicly my sincere regards for your absolutely unexpected generosity and appreciation. This community is filled with genuinely awesome humans and I thank you all from the bottom of my heart, and on behalf of my beautiful wife, for all that you do. Clarifications, the least first, just to get it out of the way, my first language is American English and my third is British English. For those who argue they are the same language, have it your way. It was meant as a throwaway line and a bit of humor. It did generate a lot more questions than I would have expected. My fifth language is also English, in a way, but many consider ASL, American Sign Language, to be a different language from English while still insisting that British English and American English are the same thing. This perplexes me somewhat, but again, not a hill I am prepared to die on. For those who challenge my writing style by asking who talks that way. Well, I do. Not your cup of tea? I understand. But thank you for visiting. For those who love it, thank you. Sincerely. And for those handful of eagle eyes who caught me in a misspelling, which I won't correct here, the original post remains untouched. Well done you. I did mean hopping not hoping. In an attempt to keep the story brief and leave out unnecessary details, I left out a few very pertinent ones. Many have been confused as to how Airport 77 would even be an option available on the airplane in the first place. The answer is simple, it wasn't. At the time this event took place, there were services that provided cartridges of movies in a format that was used exclusively on planes and boats. The airlines or cruise lines would pay a handling and licensing fee and the cartridge itself, I'm led to believe, would track the number of uses so that proper charges could be made. This is why the movie could not be stopped once started. So, it was rather akin to a member of the flight crew going to a specialized Blockbusters and picking a movie from their selections. Since they also served boats, it would include options that were perhaps not intended for use on planes. Consistent with public exhibition rules of the day, these were specialized versions of the movies that excluded foul language and nudity. I also appear to have not made it clear enough in the original post that it was illegal for classy flight attendant to fly into New York City without having been provided her mandatory rest period, and this not only risked the airline being penalized if they had been audited, it placed in jeopardy her FAA certifications, without which she would be unable to continue working in her profession. Update: for this to make sense, a little context is needed. I first learned of this event from others who were around at the time it happened and not from beautiful wife herself. She is actually not particularly proud of this malicious compliance and doesn't like to talk about it much. However, for her co-workers on that flight and others in her company who heard about it, as well as her sisters, for them she is a legend for this as well as other events she doesn't like to talk about much. One involving an intended petty revenge that almost crash-landed a 747 will likely be the topic of another post in another subreddit when I get the time to pin down the details and write it up. So it is that while I have gotten beautiful wife to tell me her version of the event, as well as to read and approve the original post, there was additional information to uncover. While we were on a long drive to a family event a few towns away, I expressed some of the honest concerns from this community about collateral damage, the potential of traumatizing innocents and children. For example, in the past, she has expressed that her main immediate regret while the movie was playing was a legitimate concern, she may actually cause a heart attack during the flight. Fortunately, there were no medical incidents forthcoming. Me, but what about the children? Beautiful wife, oh, there were no children on that flight. If there had been, I wouldn't have done it. Me, wasn't it your usual 747? How is it possible there were no children? Beautiful wife, no. It was only a 200-passenger jet. It was a special. That's why they wanted me on it. The context there being that classy flight attendant was in fact very classy and normally requested for any flights involving dignitaries, famous singers, or actors or other specials. It turns out the flight from New York that day was a special with two opposing sports teams, their management staffs and many rich promoters and others, from the entitled compatriots living in New York City who had enough money to go to the exhibition game they were involved in. In other words, they weren't just the entitled, they were the uber-rich uber-entitled. There was in fact much less potential for collateral damage than I had always believed existed. Also, because of the nature of this flight, her malicious compliance directly impacted the airline that didn't honor her mandatory rest period requirements. As the group on that special decided to use an American airline to return back to New York and never contracted such a flight again with National Airline. If it were not for the prominent position her father held in her country at that time, I do not doubt for a minute that she would have been fired outright. She still really enjoyed the rest provided by the 3-day suspension. And the money lost didn't matter. She didn't actually need to work at all. So, I hope you all find that additional detail as interesting as I did. Thank you all for being awesome.